Please take your seats. The program will begin in 5 minutes. Please take your seats. The program is about to begin. Please silence all phones. Our program will now begin. Please welcome to the stage Mark Miller, Global Editor of Bloomberg Live.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to Bloomberg House and our second morning of our conversation series, Breakfast at Bloomberg. Thank you so much for joining us on this cold morning. Just a note, as you can imagine, as we await the whirlwind of what's coming later today, we've had some scheduling changes. We might have a couple more, so just bear with us, but we have a great program for you this morning. And thank you again for spending your time here this morning. You can find the Wi-Fi information here. And if you're not already a Bloomberg.com subscriber, which all of you must be, right, at this point, please accept, try it out, a 3-month subscription, which you can access here through that QR code. I'd also like to thank our sponsor for this session this morning, which is Marsh. Thank you for supporting the session and making it possible. We'll kick off this program, actually, with a conversation about leading through volatility, which is essentially that's the theme, I think, of Davos at this point, but the theme of this morning's programming that we have for you. And we'll have a conversation that's been programmed and developed by my colleagues in Bloomberg Media with John Doyle, the president and CEO of Marsh, and Christian Ulbrich, the president and CEO of JLL. Then I'll see you after that with a conversation with Admiral Bauer, the former chair of the NATO Military Committee, who also has just written a book essentially about leading through extremely volatile times. And then at 8:20, we'll have Gita, Gopinath, who recently joined Harvard after serving as first deputy managing director of the IMF. And she'll be talking with my colleague, Francine Lacroix. So it's going to be great. Get set, and we'll be off now. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage John Q. Doyle, President and CEO of Marsh, and Christian Ulbrich, CEO and President of JLL, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Malika Kapoor.
Good morning.
Orders here.
John, Christian, welcome to Bloomberg House.
Good morning.
Thank you for being with us so early, and thank you for all of you for joining us so early in the morning. As Mark was saying, my God, what a volatile world we live in. It seems there's a new crisis every morning, well, every couple of hours. We barely have time to deal with one, and we're on to the next one. And what this tells us is we need a new formula for resilience, one that helps us take smarter risks, take more responsibility, deliver results, all the while the future refuses to cooperate. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity to discuss a new formula for resilience with both of you, because that is very much the theme here at Davos. John, I want to begin with you. This idea of reframing resilience. You know, we often talk about resilience when something goes wrong, but how should leaders perhaps think about resilience differently and think of it as a strength, as an advantage, rather than a constraint?
Well, good morning, and thank you again for having us. We're looking forward to the discussion here. It's a moment of polycrisis, right? It's you know, Christian and I were chatting earlier a little bit about some of the more global crises we were in leadership roles through, whether it's the global financial crisis or more recently the pandemic. Mm-hmm. But now the themes, and you mentioned things are coming at businesses and leaders all around the world every single day. But the themes we have ground wars, trade wars, culture wars. We're still in the relatively early stages of a technology revolution, which has enormous promise and opportunity, but a lot of risk associated with it as well. Immigration, growing social issues, and the frequency of extreme weather events, wreaking havoc on society and economies all over the world. And so it requires a mindset shift for sure. And I think, too often, and particularly leading into the pandemic, both governments and businesses were reactive and not proactive about managing risk. But it's a time to think about it in a different way.
to rethink it. Christian, I want to take you back to 2008, and you had just joined the Global Executive Board of JLL, and you had the Lehman collapse, right? But that was one big crisis hanging over your head, just one at that time. These days, you know, like we talked about it, you have something new hitting you every couple of hours. So how do you as a leader prepare for compounding risks?
Yeah, we probably have to see resilience and how we deal with resilience like training a muscle.
Sure.
When we had the
Yeah.
GFC, the muscle was relatively untrained, and it felt like the worst which could ever happen to us. Today, with all these multiple crises John was just mentioning, we have actually gotten used to deal with all those things. And I think, as you can see also with the reaction over the last 3 weeks, I mean, global markets have been astonishingly calm with all these things which just happened in January this year, because we have all been trained and we developed that muscle and to stay calm and to see what does that really mean. And I think that is the really interesting bit when you think about all those things which have happened over the last, let's say, 5-10 years. What has really massively changed strategy for companies, impacted strategy for companies, and what is just noise for companies? And it's very little from our point of view, from a JLL point of view, where we really had to adapt strategy. I mean, it literally boils down to Brexit and how we are operating in China.
So how are you approaching it differently? Do you wait a bit? Do you wait a beat to let the noise calm down? Is that what you've learned, is pause, or just what's the shift?
I think it's a combination. You obviously run your company in a slightly different way. I mean, it's your choice, but we have decided at JLL that we run the company with far less debt than we used to, just to have more resilience in the system.
Sure.
So that is a choice you are making. And then you have prepared your organization for those kind of challenges, because there are way too many that you can deal with them when they come up from the top. It cannot be John or Christian who's dealing with all of that. You have to really spread it out, because we have so many at the same time. And so there's an organizational change which has happened. But then there's also kind of the understanding that we are strong as an organization and we can deal with pretty much everything. I mean, in our case, we were founded in 1783.
Right.
A lot of things have gone wrong since 1783, and we are still there.
That's right.
1783, we're young. We're 1871.
Yeah, see, the junior here.
John, you work with CEOs and governments from around the world. What do you think, according to you, what are leaders most underestimating or perhaps misunderstanding about the risks we face at the start of 2026?
I will say my conversations with CEOs since the pandemic in particular have shifted. They're much more risk aware today, trying to better find that balance between efficiency and resilience. And I think, again, too many businesses were over-indexing on efficiency, prior to the pandemic. Christian gives, one example about his capital structure, right, and trying to manage that, a bit differently today than in the past. So I don't think there's one thing, and I will say I feel the direction of travel on this subject is quite good. So I feel good about that. Now it came as a result of some major global crises. If there's kind of one thing I would say, and there's obviously great promise, around AI and what that technology can mean to our businesses, what it can mean to the world, what it can mean to health and safety. But I don't hear enough discussion, and I'm encouraging more discussion from our colleagues with clients around the impacts, the risks around AI. There's a lot of discussion about job loss and the impact to economy and society, which is obviously an important conversation, and also about misinformation and disinformation, but less discussion about cyber risk as it relates to AI. And so, that's an important consideration for businesses.
I definitely want to spend some time talking about AI, but you both mentioned the pandemic. So Christian, let me ask you, what's the one lesson you learned from the pandemic that affects or shapes how you build differently? What's the biggest lesson?
From a leadership perspective, it was probably really understanding how important it is to be able to collaborate and to be with your colleagues. I mean, we have a geographically spread out top leadership team living in different countries and parts, and we were all at home. And the first meeting, we were able to come together, almost all of us. One colleague who lives in the UK wasn't allowed to travel. I dragged them all into a hotel in Silicon Valley for 3 days. And I said, even the ones who live in that area, don't go home. We all stay together.
Right.
And it was almost like a family reunion. We were so incredibly happy that we were able to be together again.
Yeah.
Because, you know, there were a lot of difficult decisions to be taken during that pandemic. And if you do everything only over a video conference, you kind of feel how the tension is sometimes rising.
Yeah.
And so understanding the difference between just being able to communicate via video or phone or being in a room together, that is probably the biggest lesson I took out of that. I didn't appreciate before maybe how important these personal relations are, even at the top leadership level.
Do you agree, John?
I do. It was an enormous leadership challenge for sure. And you know, one of the things that's really been you know, interesting for me, you know, whether it's the global financial crisis, 9/11, you know, having working in New York at that time, and then more recently the pandemic. How critical communication is, getting the teams together, sharing with your colleagues what you know, what you don't know, some of the risks you see, but setting priorities. And the clarity that can come around those priorities in a moment of crisis can be quite powerful, and you can get, you know, your organization quite focused very, very quickly. But you also want to learn from the event, right? And so, you know, we learned a great deal about the seasonality of cash flows and how we needed to manage, you know, that going forward. We changed the stress testing that, you know, we had done around certain scenarios. And we're in a very resilient business that was, on a relative basis, wasn't impacted, you know, all that much. But we're also in the business of advising clients around risk. And so, you know, how do we also learn from this event and do a better job going forward, advising companies like Christian's, so that we can help them be more resilient going forward. We were very mindful of pandemic risk inside of our company, given what we do. We actually had a risk financing program that was available that, you know, we had out in the marketplace, and for a wide variety of reasons, it wasn't accepted and, you know, kind of went by the wayside. But we've learned a great deal from that event, and I think it makes us stronger, but it's also made us a better business in how we serve our clients.
I want to talk about AI for a moment. And CEOs today are making big decisions on AI, but there's still a lot of unknowns. You know, even AI throws us surprises all the time. Christian, how do you decide? I mean, how are you leveraging AI at JLL? How are you incorporating it into your business strategy?
Yeah, it's across the board. I mean, at the end of the day, what we are doing is based on data. So I sometimes joke we are a data company, and we invested heavily into our data platform 10 years back. And I had to respond to many questions from shareholders about the return on investment, and it wasn't easy to demonstrate. Yeah. But now we are taking the benefit that our data is in really good shape. And so we have you know, dozens of different efficiency projects running on AI. So the vast majority is still focused on increasing the efficiency and helping our employees to kind of leave those tasks behind them which they don't enjoy, very repetitive tasks, which are now very much driven by AI, so that they can focus on those things which are more innovative and more creative and hopefully more fun for them. But the next step is, and that's the much more difficult one from my point of view, that you are getting more to revenue generating through AI. And that really changes the way you have to operate, and you have to interact with clients, but also your salespeople. For them, it's a tremendous change. And so that's a tough one, and I think most organizations are still struggling with that piece.
I want to talk about climate for a moment, because it's January. We're 1 year on from the Southern California wildfires. It's hard to believe it has been 1 year since then. How much is climate on the mind of CEOs these days? We've been talking about climate. We had Al Gore sitting right here yesterday as well. So tell me, how important is climate, do you think, for CEOs from what you're hearing? And I'm also curious, when you dealt with the Southern California wildfires last year, how much has the cost associated with that from an insurance perspective gone up in the last 5 years?
Yeah, so, obviously, devastating events to the communities impacted in Southern California last year. And, the rebuilding is really just beginning. So it's going to be a multi-year, process of recovery in that part of the United States. And, it's obviously a very cat-exposed area. The insurance industry is very well aware of those risks. So costs have gone up over a period of time, and they will continue to go up. We're not we don't have a major role in the mass market personal lines area, but we are an advisor to the high net worth clients in the area. So just, absolutely devastating. It'll be roughly a $40 billion insured event, but economic consequence to the region of somewhere in the range of $100+ billion. And so there's a big gap there in risk financing, a big impact to a community that, right now you would think would want to be investing in technology and infrastructure, but is going to be investing and is investing in recovery. There's a lot to learn from that event. There's a lot to learn from every weather-driven catastrophe, and so we're trying to advise communities, homeowners, business owners, in an effort to build better resilience into that community, because it is exposed to wildfire. It will happen again. We know that that will happen again, and obviously, you'd like to have a much different outcome the next time. And so communities weren't completely prepared, and many homeowners weren't very well prepared as well. And so we're trying to advise them in a way to make some different choices so that the outcomes can be different.
Christian, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that. How do you build, keeping climate change in mind? What does it mean to design buildings that can withstand climate change? Is there a situation, a scenario where you can use real estate and buildings to actually reverse climate change?
Well, that's a big ask. What you clearly see that you have now the first buildings in the world which are carbon plus. They take more carbon out than they produce in their operations. The trouble is that the construction of buildings is already producing that tremendous amount of carbon. That's why the refitting of existing building from a climate point of view usually makes much more sense than taking them down and building a new one. But those who are built new ones, you have the ability now to produce a lot of energy. Think about a large logistic facility, and you have solar panels on the roof, and they usually produce more energy than they consume in the building. So those type of things are happening. I think it's what we learned through the pandemic is that you have to create overall more resiliency in a quarter. And resiliency is not only from a climate point of view, it's also from a livability.
Sure.
And what we've seen, those quarters where you have only kind of office parks were hit the most post-pandemic because people didn't come back. They found it very dull to get into an office park, and whereas those mixed-use areas, they came back the best. There's this one saying post-pandemic, which we always say, an office has to earn the commute.
Very true.
So you have to really make it so inspiring, exciting that people are willing to take the commute to come to office. And some are still struggling on that basis.
Yes, it still lingers.
And no, I was going to add, and it's not just the properties in our clients' portfolios. It's understanding secondary impacts to your business as well to build effective resilience. So understanding supply chains, how your supply chain may be exposed to extreme weather, right? So one of the things we try to advise clients on over the years is really understanding those effects. The pandemic, of course, heightened supply chain risk for businesses, and so we developed a a tool that we've brought to market, that an AI-powered tool called Centrisk, that helps clients build a digital twin of their supply chains and how they may be exposed to extreme weather events. And then, of course, with the trade war this year, we added a trade simulator to that tool so that you can build, again, more resilience into your supply chains around trade-related risks. So examples just of how risk has compounded, over the last several years, and how businesses need to think about how they're thinking about those risks differently.
So John, historically, insurance was mainly seen as risk transfer. How do you help clients think about risk proactively so that they're better prepared and they don't have to, wait till there's frankly a catastrophe? So how can they be better prepared proactively?
Yeah, well, our risk businesses seem to be, the brand of them are better known, for procuring insurance on behalf of our clients. But if we're doing our job effectively, it's sitting down with Christian's team, making sure we help them understand all of the risks that we see, given the data that we have in advising so many companies all over the world. So understanding the risks to begin with, taking steps to mitigate those risks, then thinking about what type of risks they want to retain, and then transferring and getting financing for risks in the market for the tail risk that remains. And so it's really an outcome of a process around risk review. And so when we do our job effectively, it's not about buying insurance, it's about managing risk.
One thing I want to talk to you both about is working with governments, public-private partnerships. Christian, what does effective public-private partnership look like from your point of view?
Well, I think everybody has a role to play, and everybody has a specific knowledge. And so in our case, we are literally the intermediary between the interest of the public and then the interest of private businesses. And so there are multiple points where this comes to play. When you think about a developer, for a developer, time is money. The moment they start investing, the IRR is kicking in. And so speed to development is very important. So you can discuss with local authorities how they can approve the building permit much faster. And we have developed ways how we can entertain that there's a pre-discussion of what is being built before the developer actually kicks in with his spending money, that then when it comes to that point, that the approval comes very, very quickly. That's just one way. But it's also when many communities are lacking finance and they cannot invest into infrastructure. So you can create a program where the infrastructure is actually being paid by the developer. Obviously, there's something in return for that, but it helps both sides. And to entertain that and to find a common language is something where we can be of help.
Sure.
So there are some really terrific examples of public-private partnerships in the insurance industry to manage risk around the world. In the UK, where you live, in the United States, where I live, around terrorism risk, some extreme weather in different parts of the world. When I'm meeting with government officials, where we operate all over the world, I'm trying to make them also more aware of some of the risks that they may unknowingly be financing. And so, the pandemic is an extreme example of it, right? Government stepped in an emergency and began to write checks to keep businesses and alive and the economy moving. We have the opportunity to cooperate and collaborate in advance of events like that, so you have a more orderly process through severe risk scenarios. But I mentioned Southern California, the protection gap, just in that event. Last year, we estimate 2025 insured losses for extreme weather events, $125 billion. The economic impact of those events is going to be 2x that, about $250 billion. Huge gap that is largely being financed by governments. Of course, it won't all be financed. Some will suffer some severe financial consequences. Think about an extreme cyber event, and I'll talk to government officials and say, you're going to end up financing that risk, and there's surprise and shock to that. And I said, well, you're not going to let small businesses go down, medium-sized businesses go down, where you have constituencies. And so anyway, the ability to get in front of those events and collaborate with governments. I'm a capitalist at heart. I believe in the private sector and the role that the insurance industry can play in financing these risks, but there are certain extreme scenarios that really require thoughtful partnerships. And I would also add that in some communities around the world, we've developed innovative risk financing, parametric-driven products where communities in advance of events actually have procured insurance to cover that gap.
Do you think boards and CEOs are sufficiently accountable today for resilience outcomes? And do you believe that resilience should directly be tied to executive compensation?
Well, I think poor risk management has consequences, and the tone starts at the top. As Christian mentioned, though, it can't just be he and I. We've got to create a culture where you're balancing, again, risk and efficiency. And so given the severe consequences of events today, arguably leaders, will feel it in their compensation, whether directly or indirectly, because the consequences can be quite severe. But I think it's critical that a board and leadership teams, executives inside and with board governance, are aligned around what the top risks are, have a risk management framework, and are constantly stress testing that framework and really identifying key priorities to manage the risk.
Let's end on a note of optimism. At the start of 2026, what opportunity are you most excited about or hopeful about for this year?
Well, I would go back to the opportunity technology is providing, and specifically AI, generative AI is providing. It's a massive challenge. It's also a massive opportunity.
Yes.
And if we go beyond our immediate businesses, think about the opportunity AI is providing with regards to dealing with some of the most terrible diseases, cancer, and whatsoever. We will really leapfrog over the next couple of years due to AI, and that is really exciting. And then it will also help us to overcome some of the challenges we have with demography in most of the Western countries. I mean, most Western countries are shrinking. So who's going to do the work? We will need more technology to deal with all the work to keep kind of our wealth. And so on that end, I'm very positive. I would just hope that the world lets us focus on the real problems and not on all the noise we have to cut through at the moment.
That's a very good note to end on. So thank you so much for joining us, John, Christian. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Admiral Rob Bauer, 33rd Chair of the NATO Military Committee, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Mark Miller.
Good morning again. Admiral, thank you so much for joining us. As I was saying earlier, the theme basically of this morning is this idea of leadership and leading through volatile times, which you've had your share of doing over your career. You were the Chief of Defense and Commander of the Netherlands Armed Forces from 2017 to 2021, when you then became, I think as everyone heard, the Chair of the Military Committee of NATO, which is the most senior military officer. And you were that from June 2021 through January 2025. You left that position just days before the new president of the United States took office. Obviously, you were there during the invasion, the most recent invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And now you and your colleague, Eleonora Russell, have written a book which is provocatively titled, If You Want Peace, Prepare for War, a blueprint for deterrence. And as I understand it, when we talked, you've been advising CEOs and businesses and the public generally about how we need to think about approaching these volatile times, because without significant changes in the way that we think about the future and the way we prepare, we in the West leave ourselves quite vulnerable. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Obviously, we have to address the elephant in the room, or the two elephants in the room, Greenland, and the President of the United States' fixation on owning Greenland, which is obviously a territory of the Kingdom of Denmark, and which is obviously a key ally and an important member of NATO. So are we witnessing the destruction of NATO at this point?
No. I think NATO is too important for the US to have it broken up by this. So it is clear for me that Greenland is important for our security. And I think more and more nations understand that. It primarily has to do with the fact that, and that's interesting because climate change is actually the cause of melting of the ice in the Arctic, and therefore the waters in the Arctic become more and more navigable. And that is good news for China because 90% of the volume of everything that is transported across the world is done by merchant vessels, not value but volume. And so the Chinese benefit from this because the route to Europe and the United States is shortened with about 10 days, which is huge for that. But if merchant vessels can navigate those waters, then naval vessels can navigate them too. And that means that the Russians can bring their Pacific fleet in a much easier and faster way into the North Atlantic Ocean. And unfortunately, we see a very concerning cooperation between China and Russia more and more. China calls itself a near-Arctic state, which actually would mean that the Netherlands, my home country, would be a near-Arctic state. And what is new is that Russia actually allows China in their Arctic, in their part of the Arctic, which has never happened before, that anyone was allowed there for many and especially strategic reasons. So what you actually see is China keeps Russia in the war in Ukraine. They provide not only political support, because what they said about Greenland now, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China about Greenland, that it's a sovereign state and internationally recognized borders and that the US should respect that. I've never heard that announcement with regard to Ukraine towards Russia. So that is interesting. And secondly, they produce no weapons for Russia as they formally state, but they give Russia every part, all the raw materials to make all the weapons that Russia needs. So actually, indirectly, they give weapons to Russia. Now, for me, it's clear that all of this, what we see happening, is about rebalancing power between the US and China. That's where the turmoil comes from. And I think we will be in this for at least 10 to 15 years, hopefully with as little war as possible. But if tectonic plates shift, then there's earthquakes. And if tectonic plates of power shift, there's unfortunately crises and wars. And I think that's what we see now. It's not necessarily a World War III, but it can be regional wars, it can be local wars, but it will be volatile for a while until there is a new balance between those two powers. And although people talk about Russia as a world power, only China and the US actually have the economy to reach their ambitions. Of course, Russia has nuclear weapons, and therefore it is an important country where you have to take into account. But so I think this is about China and the US. And I think when you look at Greenland, it is a very important and strategic island, but for NATO, I would say. So NATO can actually help the United States to remain safe. I don't think the US needs to own Greenland for achieving that. Since World War II, there is treaties and agreements with the Kingdom of Denmark to actually work on Greenland, in and around Greenland. The US withdrew from Greenland and left only about 150 military personnel in a base, but is now interested to go back, and that is understandable.
And you agree with that?
And I agree with that, because I'm really concerned about the Russian-Chinese cooperation. This is far beyond Ukraine. This is, as I said, about the Arctic, but it is also about hypersonics. It's about space. It's about raw materials. And so, I mean, China produces about 38% of the world's production. So to be independent from China is impossible by now. And if President Trump, for example, talks about bringing back the automobile industry to the United States, it is actually a discussion of assembly more than of production, because all the parts that are in those cars basically come from China. And there's no nation on earth at the moment who can produce at mass with precision and on time and within the agreed price. So that is an amazing thing. And then when it comes to raw materials, we see an increasing dependency on China, because we were only thinking about efficiency in the West. We were only thinking about getting rich, and nobody was thinking strategically and about effectiveness. And so I think we sold all the mines, and we are now surprised they own them, and that they actually start using it.
And outsource the manufacturing.
And to actually use it against us.
Right, right. I think that's a good segue into the thinking in your book, which is, again, this idea of preparing for war is how you maintain peace, which, again, I think is a very different perspective than what we've been living through in the last 30 years or so. And is that a lesson that you think our NATO allies and the EU, the rest of the EU, has embraced yet, has learned? Where does that stand? Because that also has been a major complaint of the President of the United States, as well as others, that Europe was not shouldering a sufficient amount of the burden for its own defense.
There's a good number of things that I do not agree with President Trump, but I fully agree with him when it came to NATO and the contribution of the nations other than the US and maybe Poland and the Baltic states at the time. Right. So I think the Americans in general, not MAGA, not Republicans, not President Trump, not the White House, but the Americans in general are sick and tired of Europeans and Canadians that are not taking responsibility for their own security. And I think Europe has had almost free security for 40 years. They had free goods from China and free oil and gas from Russia, and all three is over. And I think that's why in especially Europe, the shock is biggest, because people start to realize it is something we have to work on. And as I said earlier, yesterday, I think there's a lot of people that sort of understand the wake-up call, but too many people are still in bed. And I think they need to come out of bed and start to show results and get into action mode, because there's a lot of talk in Europe, but there's not a lot of walk. And so I think that is the change that needs to happen. It will cost money. It will have an impact on other things in our societies. That is a difficult thing for politicians, but that's their job. What I'm trying to do is to convince people that it's not only strong armed forces if you want to deter the Russians, but if you look at hybrid warfare and the things that the Russians have used against Ukraine, they've used energy as a weapon, food as a weapon, migration as a weapon. Of course, there's information as a weapon on a daily basis, cyber warfare. All these things together make it that we have to, as a society, become stronger. And that includes the private sector. It means that for a long time people thought the economy was something in a silo, and there was a security silo, and they were separate. Until very recently, not a lot of business leaders were interested in the security discussion.
Right.
And I think they are waking up to that, and I think it is connected. security is the cross-cutting theme here, and I think that is something people start to understand now. But it is also all these other areas where you have to become stronger. You have to be able to resist shocks. That's what resilience is about. And if you look at hybrid warfare and the things the Russians have been doing in the last 5 years, this is not only drones over airports, this is arson, this is murder attempts. There was a murder attempt on the CEO of Rheinmetall in the summer of 2024. This is serious business. This is because a defense company is very successful, and that is worrying for the Russians. And so this is all connected to each other, and this is about migration as a weapon. So as a society, we need to understand we need to do more than just spend money on the armed forces. I think we sort of outsourced security to the armed forces. Right. We give you money, but we don't want to be bothered too much with it. And if I ask people, do you want more security in a big room, then most of the people will raise their hand and say, yeah, I want more security. And then I say, can you imagine you will become part of the solution? And then people look shocked at me because that's where we have the military for. Well, ladies and gentlemen, those professional military soldiers will go to war for all of us. They will, don't you worry. And Article 5 will work. If Estonia is attacked, we will evoke Article 5. That's the question that's probably coming as well. But the problem is of war that after 2 days, soldiers get wounded and soldiers die. And where do you think the new soldiers come from? It is from our societies, because it is our problem. It's not someone else's problem. It is our problem that we as a society have to solve. And I think that realization is that someone else will solve my problem is deeply ingrained by now. The individualism is so deeply ingrained by now. It's about my rights, my privacy. Everything is about me. Whereas a society is not the sum of all the me's. And if I say, people, do you really believe you have privacy? I hope nobody thinks that. Google knows we're all here. Right. And you all gave that away, willingly. But if the government says, can I look in your phone for 10 seconds, there's a revolution. It's ridiculous in a way.
Well, to that end, though, in terms of this whole of society approach, the countries in Europe and the United States, we don't have a command and control economy, not yet anyway, which is something of a disadvantage, against adversaries like China, like Russia, who can organize their economies in ways that make them all on the same path. So how do we tackle that?
Yeah, it is about convincing people. That's why I'm here today. It is about convincing people it's necessary to start to move. Because the hyper-focus on efficiency and accountability for the last 40 years means that we have lost, in certain areas, our effectiveness. And so the just-in-time, just-enough economy that we have created as a result, and it is about maximizing the output of the production system. If you order your car, you will hear it's in the third quarter of 2026 in the color and with the leather seats they will start building it only after you have ordered it. And that's, so all that is enormously efficient, but it's not necessarily effective. As we've seen with the pandemic, we needed more than we could produce, and we now see it in a war where you need more than we can produce. And so this is about ramping up the production capacity in the defense industry. When I started talking in my capacity as the chair of the military committee to the defense industry, it's always someone else's fault. So they started to point their finger at the financial sector, and they said, we can't get a loan because it's not ethical to invest in defense, or it's against the sustainability goals, or what have you. And so then I started to talk to the pension funds and the banks, and they said, yeah, it's against the sustainability goals. And then I spoke to a CEO of a bank, and I said, I mean, look it up. Is it really a problem? I don't believe it's a real... And he came back to me a week later and said, no, it's not a problem. Actually, there's no regulations that forbid us for doing this. So we will solve this, he said. Well, I said, it will take much longer than you believe, because this is a transformation issue. If you have learned for 40 years to do something in a certain way in an organization, and all the people that work there think about efficiency first and foremost, and the last 20 years they think about sustainability, then it's not a switch. Because the loan of 5 million euros for this startup is not on the desk of the CEO. It's on the desk of a mid-level staffer. And if that person believes it's against the sustainability goals, it ends up on the no stack.
We have, I have, and my colleagues throughout Bloomberg have begun noticing, though, in Europe, this change of definition of sustainability to include the sustainability of democracies, of a way of life. So some of that seems to be getting through at this point.
But it takes much longer than I would like.
Right. Do we have that time?
No, we don't have the time. And the whole thing about a transformation is that it takes a long time. And the only good thing, and really that's the only good thing about a war, is that it helps you focus tremendously. Because in a war, it's only about effectiveness, not about efficiency. And so that is what, and so I hope we can make this change without a war. But if people still think it's a faraway problem, and if people still think it's a choice, and if people think it's still sort of charity resilience, then my message is it isn't. The choice has been made for us by Russia and China. We should be prepared.
And we've seen that focus and the clarity of focus that comes with war in Ukraine, certainly in the way that we now understand and how to fight those wars and what's necessary to fight those wars. But I'm not sure, as you say again, that lesson has been learned by the rest of Europe and the United States, for that matter, the public. So are we at risk of sleepwalking into this into a greater crisis?
In a way we are, because I very often hear, Admiral, the tanks, the Russian tanks will not roll through the streets of Davos or wherever I am, then that city is named. But again, if you look at what war is, it's not just at the front line. Right. We are, in a way, one could say, sort of at war when it comes to cyber. Yeah. We are at war sort of...
We're in low intensity
in information domain. We are. We are challenged.
And the other acts of sabotage, murder.
And all the other things that is
That's
happening.
all happening at
That is all happening on a daily basis. I think cyber-wise, companies have started to understand earlier than physical security that was a challenge. And so I think in cyber, we are a little bit better off than in other areas. Right. But there's a lot of things that needs to become more resilient.
You were saying to me earlier, though, that people think, the streets here are safe. My life in Amsterdam is wonderful. Berlin, New York, for that matter. But that could change very quickly. No.
Yes. So I explain in a theater performance about the book that if there is a war in Estonia, for example, that it will also lead to huge hybrid attacks, including cyber attacks. For example, if you look at Spain, there was a 24-hour power outage. Enormous chaos. Enormous chaos. In the Netherlands, at any given time, there's 45,000 people in an elevator. So if there's a power outage, these people need to be saved in a way. You can't get to, within 2 hours, there's a battery in your phone that is still full, but the batteries at the masts where the mobile transmitters are is gone. So after 2-3 hours, you can't make a mobile phone call anymore. So how do you reach your people if you want to organize your company? So you can't go to the bank because the bank machines do not work anymore because of the power outage. Then you think, I'll get my car. But other people thought about that as well, and there's no fuel anymore. So how do you reach your parents, and how do you go to your work if there's a crisis? So I say to companies, if you haven't thought about this, you will find yourself in a crisis without any plan. And if you then say as a company, okay, I did a scenario, and as a result, I now have satellite phones, which is a great example of resilience in terms of being able to continue part of the work, to be able to organize yourself. Then it shouldn't be in the box in your office, in the cupboard, because without having been loaded, because then it doesn't work either. So you need to also do some exercising as companies. The CEO at some point should actually say, there's no current, I want to see those phones, and I want you I want you to phone me in 5 minins or in 2 minutes.
Right.
And if there's no battery charged, then there is a problem for that person. So all these things you have to understand that it's not just thinking about it and the solution. You also have to live through the
or
solution.
that someone else will come to the rescue.
And then someone else will come to the rescue, where actually you can only solve your problem.
We don't have much time left, just 30 seconds, but do you see, lost in all of this conversation about Greenland, is Ukraine and what happens about the war, the end of the war? Do you see any end of the war in Ukraine anytime soon?
For me, it's unacceptable if Putin can walk away from this war as the winner. That's one. And I don't see how that is benefiting the US if that is the case. So I don't understand that that is beneficial for the US as well. Second, at the moment, I don't think there's any incentive for Putin to end the war. And there's 3 reasons. One, he hasn't reached any of his strategic goals. He doesn't even have the Donbas region. So that's one. Second, he has a war economy that's he's done that quite well. So the Russians are producing more than they need for the war in Ukraine, weapons and ammunition. And so they are reconstituting their armed forces whilst at war. So that's quite an achievement. And that means we have less time to prepare ourselves and to become better, in accordance with all the agreements that the leaders have made in NATO. And thirdly, there are 700,000 soldiers in occupied Ukraine. And many of them are traumatized. If the war ends, they will not get the high pay anymore. A lot of them are partly wounded and have to continue to fight. There's more than 1 million soldiers dead or wounded as a result of this war in Russia alone. So all these soldiers will come back to Russia and will cause a lot of trouble, as the Russian soldiers that came back from Afghanistan in the early 90s. That led to the spike in criminality in Russia. So I think that is the challenge for him. So why would he end the war if it causes only problems for him? So there's no incentives for him. And the one that wants peace is President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people, but it should be a just peace. And that means that it might lead to giving up some territory. I think the Ukrainians, nobody wants that, but they sort of understand it might be part of the outcome, but it cannot be a peace where they are going to be attacked again in 2-3 years' time. Then what have we achieved?
Meanwhile, we're arguing about Greenland. So
Greenland is not going to be militarily attacked. I cannot imagine that is going to happen.
all right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Admiral.
Okay.
Please welcome to the stage Gita Gopinath, Professor of Economics at Harvard University, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Francine Lacroix.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, everyone. So we also have a little bit of a treat. First of all, we're speaking to Gita, which is always a treat. We'll look at the world economy. I'll ask you about trade, tariffs, and AI. And then right after, we'll also be joined by the former Polish president, Andrzej Duda, for a good conversation on security, on Ukraine, and of course on everything that's going on with Greenland. So don't miss that. That's right after my conversation with Gita Gopinath. Thank you so much for joining us. Look, the world had moved on from trade and tariffs. If you spoke to economists or surveys, we were like, oh, that was a 2025 thing. And now they're like back with a vengeance. How much do you worry that the latest geoeconomics concerns on Greenland and the tariff threats derail the US economy and the world economy?
Francine, I agree with you that I think we all came into this year hoping that we were past peak tariffs and past peak uncertainty, but all of that has blown up very quickly. Now, we should always keep in mind is that there is a difference between the numbers that get thrown out and what actually gets implemented, and that happened all of 2025. So if you look at the headline numbers for tariffs and the announcements, the tariff rate in the US was around over 20%, so about 25%. But if you looked at the actual tariffs being paid at the border on the US side, on the US border, the tariff rate is around 14%. So it's much lower than what the sticker headline number was, which is why the consequences of the tariffs were also smaller than was feared initially. Now, I was hoping that we would have more clarity at this point, but that's clearly not the case. I thought by now we would have the Supreme Court's decision on tariffs, which was supposed to have come last week. It was supposed to come yesterday, but it hasn't happened yet. But that will tell us something more about how tariffs can be used. And I thought that the midterm elections, which now has become an issue of affordability, would be some sort of a guardrail against having further rounds of tariffs. But clearly, we're in a different place altogether. This is no longer about global imbalances. It's no longer about US trade deficits. It's about basically using tariffs as a tool against any international grievance.
I mean, this is weaponizing, basically, of the tariffs. Who paid for the tariffs last year? So there's a number of studies out saying that actually it's probably American consumers that paid 70 to 80% of that extra burden. Is that fair?
So actually, I did some research with a co-author at Harvard. We put a paper out last year, which basically shows that about 90% of the tariff was borne by, firstly, the American importer, and a small fraction of that was passed through. A small fraction of that was passed through to consumers. So 90% borne by American importers, firms, small fraction passed through, which is pretty much exactly how it played out in 2018-19. It was the same story. So while indeed there is a substantial amount of tax revenue being collected from the tariffs, it's basically being paid by US firms and importers.
Gita, I mean, even before these extra threats over Greenland of tariffs, there was a concern that actually inflation would pick up this year. Is this an overhang of what happened last year for the tariffs, or is this that did it come up from any other parts of the economy?
The baseline expectation is that tariffs will not get out of control. Sorry, inflation will not get out of control. Now, I do believe there is about a half of the impulse to inflation coming from tariffs that's supposed to play out this particular year. So we get about a half a percentage point coming from the tariffs of 2025. But otherwise, because of the increase in productivity that we've seen in the US, unit labor costs are actually not growing at a very, like 1.5%, 2.5% to keep bringing inflation down. The risk, of course, is that with further rounds of tariffs, with the fact that the one big beautiful bill tax incentive can increase investment, and because of that, that would be an increase in demand. The shrinkage in in terms of labor force because of the drop in immigrants, all of that is an inflationary pressure that could play out. Yeah. And in that event, the Fed may actually need to raise interest rates, which is something that is really not being priced in by markets.
Are we importing deflation from China? Because if you look at deflation in China, it took many people by surprise.
So China is exporting deflation to many parts of the world. We're not seeing much of an effect of that on the US because the tariff is coming on top of those deflated prices.
Gita, when you look at some of the things that we worry about, Fed independence is largely not priced by the markets, but does it change the dynamics of what we could see from the Fed? Like truly?
At this point, a lot is not priced by the markets if you think of the big shifts that are happening. I don't think the markets really truly believe we're going to have a breakdown of NATO. And markets don't believe that we're going to have the end of central bank independence. So all of these are possibilities, but not priced into markets because the hope is that this will not really play out as things go forward. That is a risk. Now, there's going to be the name that's going to be announced relatively soon, who's going to be the next Fed chair in May. We have to keep in mind that it takes about 12 people to make the Fed rate decision. It's not one person. It's not the chair that makes a decision, but it's a 12-person committee that makes a decision. But that said, it is the chair that goes out there and does a press conference alone and communicates to the world about what is US monetary policy, what is the path of it. And we've known that in the past, with the best of central banks, we've had tantrums. So I do think that if we find ourselves with a Fed that is more divided on every rate decision, there's a lot less clarity coming from the number one central bank in the world, which is consequential for all of the world.
Yeah, and Gita, when you're constantly attacked by the president, even if you stay the course, it's just not easy, right? So biases can kind of creep in, I guess, because you're getting so much pressure.
what worried me about this recent criminal investigation of Chair Powell was less about Chair Powell, because I don't think that's going to stick at all. And anyway, his term ends in May for being chair. What I was concerned was that this would have a chilling effect on everybody else on the committee, because it was a signal saying that if you don't do what I would hope you do, we'd throw the state machinery at you. And I think that's the bigger concern, which is why we need strong pushback from everybody, including from Congress. And we did see that come from some Republicans. And it has to be in the strongest possible terms, because otherwise you are going to have this hangover, which is, people will think, well, I'm going to have the state come and investigate me if I don't cut rates.
We talked a little bit about China, but India is seen as the biggest nation that could have the most growth and the most, I guess, industrial prowess. Is this the decade for India?
So India is doing well in terms of growth. I think that we just had an upgrade for 2026 for India, but the IMF upgraded it to around 7.3%, I believe. So it is one of the fastest growing nations of the world. It could be a very promising decade for India. Potential growth in India is at around 6.5%, which is still great. It's going to get to the number 3 economy status by 2028, given how things are going. It is indeed one of those economies that you want to look at, but it's another country that's in a bit of a difficult spot with the US, because it has a tariff war, and in fact, right now it has one of the highest tariff rates that it's facing compared to many other US trading partners. About, the sticker number is 50%, the effective rate is about 36%. So that's unresolved. That was not something people expected that would be the case.
AI, where do you stand on AI? You speak to a lot of the tech companies and say, look, this is the biggest revolution we've seen in 200 years. And then you speak to psychologists and they say, this is the biggest worry we've seen in 200 years. We haven't really seen the impact concretely on macroeconomics. How do you view it?
I increasingly believe it is one of the most, if it is the most transformative technology of our lifetimes. I've been playing with it myself, and it is remarkable what it can do. So I do think it's going to transform growth and productivity and jobs, without a doubt. That's, of course, quite separate from what it tells us about market valuations. Mm-hmm. Market valuations still strike me as quite high. I find it's difficult to believe that all of these companies can generate the kinds of profits that will be required to justify all of their high valuations. This is a pretty competitive industry at the current moment. It's not just OpenAI competing with Anthropic, but you also have DeepSeek and you have what's coming out of China. So that's where I think the risk is. So the question is, how do you make the profits from it? How do you make the rents from it? But without a doubt, I do think it's going to be transformative, both in terms of raising productivity and growth.
What's your biggest worry when it comes to the jobs market? So we're hearing, chief executives having to spend so much money on some of these AI models that maybe they decide to hire less staff at the junior level because it's costly to train them. Is this something that will level out, or is this a real concern?
This is a real concern. Again, I don't think we should say that the data that we're seeing right now tells us that we're going to end up with a whole lot of joblessness. That's not the case. It's still early days for it. But it is something that is very reasonable to expect. I mean, a likely scenario is where you have a shrinking of the middle class, which is you have those at the very high end of the income spectrum. They earn a lot from this technology. Usually when that happens, there's a huge amount of demand for low-skilled services, so that group does well, and it's the middle class that shrinks. And I think that is a risk because it's not just about manufacturing this time around, it's also about services. It's a lot depends upon the speed with which this transition happens. Firms are adopting it, but not at an extremely high speed or anything like that. But this could be in the next couple of years, we'll see how the uptake is. And something I like to remind people all the time is that, automation-related job losses happen in a recession. So the last time we had a big wave of layoffs tied to automation that never came back was the great financial crisis. 85% of job losses tied to automation happened during that first year of the GFC. And we had the so-called jobless recovery, where we had growth coming back very quickly, but jobs didn't come back. And we know that created a lot of stress in society, something that has lasted a very long time, including into the recent elections in the US.
Do you expect every job, every sector to be touched in some way or another?
I do believe, yes. I think this is a general purpose technology. It's affecting everybody. I just returned to Harvard last September. You know, I was there 7 years ago. For 7 years, I was at the IMF, but before that, I was at Harvard. I just returned back, and for the first time, I'm going back to giving oral exams, because that's the only way I'll know if the person the student I'm dealing with actually knows what they're talking about.
Does it change actually academia? I mean, we've spoken at events a lot about, you know, people's children, like people that have to go to university right now. Do you think it changes the process of learning?
It absolutely does. You know, what's interesting at Harvard is that we actually have students telling us, in a way, can you please tie our hands? Right? Because they are afraid that they will rely so much on this technology that there will be this somehow illusion that they are knowledgeable and they know what they're doing, but without having the assistance, that they would actually truly not know what they're talking about. It's like having an incredibly smart friend who every time you turn to, you have a tough problem to solve, and you turn to your smart friend and the person says, here's the answer. You see the answer and you're like, of course, yes, now I get it. But if I give you the exact same problem another time around, you can't solve it on your own. It takes repetition, it takes exercise to keep doing it. So that's an interesting challenge for students that we're, as faculty, are also dealing with.
Yeah, so what's the right way to think about it? Like, you have to think, I mean, is there a certain time limit? Or I don't know how you know, if you were 20 years old, how would you do this problem?
Well, I think what you, as you know, professors, what you have to do is basically not rely on take-home exams or on problem sets. That's not the way. You do have to, in a sense, you're going analog, which is you're basically going to sit down with the student and ask them and see what they think.
And there's also a danger that you have the have and the have-nots, and that gap widens because of this technology. I mean, how do you ensure that actually we don't get more polarized, divided, and that the ones that have less have even less after this technology is widely adopted?
Yeah, this is a perennial challenge with technology, and again, given how widespread this is and how quickly it could be adopted, we may be behind the curve already in trying to prevent this inequality gap from increasing. We know the lessons from the past and what it takes. It takes retraining. It takes retraining on the job, not just in terms of going to school and retraining. It takes lifelong learning. It will also take social safety nets to be able to adapt to this. And there have been some clever ways of helping people who are unemployed. You know, what typically happens is that people do not move to other jobs very quickly. You know, as an economist, you think, well, you move on to wherever the jobs are, but that doesn't happen. People don't change occupations very quickly. They don't want to leave their communities and their societies. And so that requires what's called labor market policies for communities. One very interesting instrument that was used to deal, for example, with trade-related shocks was to basically say, okay, move to this job. Usually what happens is people have to take a job cut, and they don't want to take a job cut because, you know, it's not good for one's ego. But what the state basically did was to say, okay, we will subsidize, we will make the difference between the wage that's being paid in the new job and what used to get paid in the past. And that worked very well. People did move jobs, and that actually brought people back into the workforce much quicker. So policies along those lines are helpful.
Do you see policymakers actually thinking about it properly? Because there's a lot of distraction. We're all waiting to see what President Trump has to say. The numbers of crises seem to be multiplying. And so is there a way, is there a worry that actually countries take their eyes off this AI challenge?
Absolutely, that is a worry. There is a certain bandwidth to how, administrations, bureaucrats can deal with the many issues of the day. The more you have to deal with these global geopolitical events, the less time you have to be able to focus on domestic matters.
Is there a country that's doing it right, or at least thinking about it right? And are they at speeds? Because this technology could come much quicker than we even think.
I think all countries have woken up to AI. I think everybody wants to get the great potential from it, but they're also thinking about the risks to it. I don't know whether people are ready for what would be rolled out in the event of mass-scale unemployment that can be very persistent. Is our unemployment insurance system ready for that? No, I don't think we're ready for that yet. So the hope is that there have a few more years before anything like that happens.
How do you see the rollout? And again, this has also it could inform us on the rapidity of the job losses.
Again, I think what we have to do is try and prevent a financial crisis and a recession from happening.
Yeah.
it seems like we're trying very hard to make one of those happen. You know, there's too much going on in the world right now with all these dramatic events on a daily basis. It is pretty remarkable that despite a pandemic, despite a war in Ukraine, despite the Fed raising interest rates very sharply, we did not have a financial crisis. The financial conditions have been quite easy, not just in the US, but in pretty much all parts of the world, including in emerging and developing countries. So the risk is that if that were to change, that would be, I think, a big knock on the global economy.
But do you see anything as systemic? I mean, could we see something resembling a global financial crisis, or have we carved off, enough resilience so that no matter what happens, it could be a tough time, but it wouldn't feel like the end of the world?
So on the plus side, I would say that the banks are in a much better shape than they were at the time of the great financial crisis because of the regulation. They're in a stronger position. But on the other hand, if you look at pretty much any other asset class, it looks very stretched. Be it stock markets, be it government bonds, despite the very high levels of debt, be it corporate bonds, emerging market spreads, everything points to this being as good as it gets, which means there's only, in a sense, one way to go.
Gita, final question. If you were a teenager now, what would you go and study and where? For the jobs of tomorrow.
I think what's going to be very important as a young person is to make sure that you are sharpening your own cognitive skills. I am afraid that there's a temptation to delegate that to the new technology that exists, and so you don't end up actually picking up any expertise in any area. I would say that focus on making sure that you unplug and develop your own cognitive skills.
Gita, Gopinath, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you. Poland. Thank you. Thank you, Gita.
Yes. Please welcome to the stage Bloomberg New Economy Editorial Director, Eric Schatzker.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Eric Schatzker. I'm the editorial director of Bloomberg New Economy, and it is my great pleasure to welcome to the stage His Excellency, the former President of Poland, Andrzej Duda. Your Excellency. Welcome. Well, I know where I'd like to begin, and I suspect you have a good idea as to what it is. Poland, being a member of NATO, has been closely watching what President Trump has been saying and threatening with regard to Greenland. And the European Union is, as we speak, trying to make a decision about how to respond. We understand that President Macron would like to respond with force, to invoke the European Union's anti-coercion measures, perhaps the strongest economic instrument that it has available, and that the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz is not so certain, perhaps wavering. What would you like to see the European Union do? What should it do?
First and most important element is NATO unity. This is a difficult situation we have now, but I believe that that this is kind of political game, and I hope that there is no possibility for any military actions around Greenland. Of course, I always hope, because you never know what really would happen. Yes, but I don't believe that there is any possibility of any military action, especially if you really look at what President Trump has been saying since the beginning of his second term in office. Yes, and of course he is he is interested in Greenland. Yes, because because this is strategic place from this military point of view, also from the point of view of the security and the potential defense of the United States of America. So this is so having kind of control over this territory is in the interest of the United States and American
obvious.
Citizens, in his opinion. Yes, but if you look at his statements, he rather says about some kind of transaction concerning this territory, about some purchasing. Yes.
Well, it's easier to buy than it is to
buy.
take by force. But if I'm not mistaken, he himself has talked, if not in person, on X or Truth Social, about invading Greenland. Is that just an empty threat?
You know, this is in my opinion very difficult to get, yes, and very difficult to accept. But this especially for politicians. But this is some kind of tricks in negotiations.
It's just a negotiating tactic.
In my opinion, President Trump treats this process as a process of negotiations concerning this territory and who will really control this territory.
Okay, if that's the case, and these are just negotiating tactics, deal making, as it were. How do you see things unfolding? The president has said he's going to, it's not a threat, he said he's going to impose 10% tariffs on 8 European countries, including the UK, as of February the 1st, rising over the next several months to 25%. Is that too a negotiating tactic? And if he were to go ahead and do that, and the European Union chooses to respond with these anti-coercion measures, where does it end? That's just a game of escalation. We saw, there was a game of escalation last year after Liberation Day, and fortunately cooler heads prevailed, and the tariffs that President Trump had initially threatened were dramatically scaled back, even for China. Is that what's going to happen again? What some people like to refer to as a taco, or, you know, whatever term you choose. Is that where this is going, or is it going to escalate and then result in a less pleasant outcome? Let's put it that way.
You know, if you look at this situation from the interest of Poland.
Yes.
I'm not a president of Poland anymore. This is not.
But you were recently.
Yes, I was. But I'm not a president of Poland anymore. Now we have Karol Nawrocki in office, and this is his responsibility, and it would be probably his decision if there is a situation that he will have to make some decisions over this problem. But in my opinion, yes, this is very harsh tactic of negotiations.
You don't feel
all these announcements about possible tariffs, etc., some suggestions the military intervention, yes, this is very, very harsh method of the negotiations. Yeah,
What
this is my interpretation. This is my humble opinion. You know, I talked with President Trump a lot. So during my both terms in office in the presidential palace in Warsaw, especially we had a lot of meetings in his first during his first term in office. I had 4 official visits in the White House during this his first 4 years of his presidency, and so I talked with him a lot, and I know this language.
So how should European leaders respond? Should they, fight fire with fire, talk tough, act tough, as Macron is suggesting? What should they do?
So my advice would be tough, but take it easy. But be tough. And wait.
With all due respect, Your Excellency,
and
that
wait.
doesn't really make sense.
You know, I am in heart, I am a Democrat. So if you ask me, what about Greenland? I always say, excuse me, but what about people in Greenland? What about Greenlanders? What is their opinion? Maybe we should ask them what they want, what they really want.
Are you suggesting they have a referendum?
It's possible, yeah. This is the democratic way of the making decision. So this is the this is the question.
This is a question of national self-determination.
Believe me, I am a citizen. I am and a patriot of the one of in Europe quite big, but in general not very big countries. Yes, and I was born in the Soviet sphere of influences. And I spent my first 18 years, 18, 17, first years of my life under the communist regime. So believe me, I really believe in democracy, and I really want to know what people, what they want in Greenland, because first and foremost, we should ask them. And I'm a little bit, disgusted when I hear these discussions concerning the island and the territory. Who would be stronger? Is it European? Is it Danish? Is it American? Sorry, this is Greenland, and there are citizens of this territory, of this country, and they should decide what about them and who is their ally and what kind of military bases they would like to have in their country and why.
Does that not legitimize a certain kind of behavior? For example, let's say the Spaniards, fancied having Puerto Rico back. Should they just put it to a vote in Puerto Rico? Would you like to go become part of Spain? And not only would you like to become part of Spain, Spain is offering you a significant amount of money to become part of Spain. I mean, I know it sounds a little absurd, but you can see this kind of thing devolving into a little bit of nonsense internationally, no?
In my opinion, this is there is a lot of factors around, but because this is also this very serious factor of the security, yes, that this territory of the Arctic, yes, is
it's covered by NATO.
Of course, but you have a lot of Russian military forces and Chinese military forces, submarines and others around. Yes,
this is true, but it seems the Danes seem very willing to accept the idea that we should have a much bigger U.S. military presence in Greenland.
Also, these submarines equipped in nuclear missiles. Yes. So this is very sensitive issue, and it's difficult to compare it to the situation in Puerto Rico or the situation in Poland, for example. Now, yes, different situation.
Well, let's talk about Poland then for a moment. again, we all have been listening, watching, observing President Trump's actions in his second term. We know what he did recently in Venezuela. We know what the Trump administration has said as part of its new national security strategy. We now know about the so-called Donroe Doctrine, asserting a sphere of influence over the Western Hemisphere and prioritizing hemispheric security. Does that action in Venezuela, does the potential action in Cuba, does this potential action in Greenland, again, to use the same term that I used moments ago, not legitimize a certain kind of behavior if American unilateralism gives license to other superpowers to behave in a unilateral way? Does that not excuse, in a manner of speaking, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine? Would it not similarly excuse Vladimir Putin from steamrolling over the rest of Ukraine and perhaps across Polish borders?
But this is not a new situation. I'm talking about Venezuela, yes?
Well, this is American unilateralism is a relatively...
This is not a new situation. We saw the situation in Iraq with Saddam Hussein.
Sure.
Yes, we saw the situation in Libya with Gaddafi.
I mean, there's a long catalog of American misadventures overseas.
Not only American. So first, we should ask, had been Mr. Maduro officially recognized head of the state in this international political environment?
Oh, I think I understand where you're
going.
Because he was an illegitimate leader.
He was
defrauded the Venezuelans out of their election result.
He was illegitimate
well, hey, so that makes him
leader and
makes him fair game.
And he had that was an authoritarian regime. Yes, we can call this kind of authority these words. So this is very special situation. There are two elements, of course. One is the clear interest of the United States of America. This clear interest is to stop drug supplies from Venezuela to the United States. You probably remember that Mr. Maduro was accused by Americans of his participation in the drug cartels.
Sure.
Also, this 15 years ago, yeah. So that was not that's not a new story, yes.
But let's bring it back to Poland for a moment. Does this new hemispheric assertion that Trump is making not effectively carve up the world into spheres of superpower
One moment,
influence?
but the second element, very important, is of course this huge game Donald Trump plays now with Kremlin, with Putin, also regarding
Ukraine.
Yes, Ukraine. Yes, because this is also the question of Russian of the economic situation in Russia. You know that Russia finances its war in Ukraine from its natural resources.
Sure, oil sales.
Oil, yes. So if you take into account how big are reserves of oil in Venezuela, this is 1/5 of the reserves in the earth, yes. As I remember, 303 billion barrels, yes. So if you add it to the American reserves and American energy potential, it's a huge and a very strong power together, and it probably could have a terrible impact on the energy market. Yes, so also impact for the energy prices, oil prices especially, and also, in my opinion, natural gas.
Since you brought it up, I'm going to ask one last question of you, which is about Ukraine.
Yeah.
Something of great interest to Poland. Should Volodymyr Zelensky accept what appear to be terms of a peace agreement as negotiated up till now between President Trump and President Putin and, of course, their emissaries? Should he give away a significant percentage of Ukrainian territory in exchange for what appear to be uncertain security commitments on behalf of the United States?
Taking into account in a meaning Poland, yes, my Polish, very difficult history, especially the result of the Second World War, when we Poles were left in the Soviet zone of influence by our allies, Western allies. We fought with them shoulder to shoulder, yes, against Nazi Germans, and they left us in the Soviet sphere of influences. The most important element now is that Volodymyr Zelensky should be present in any negotiations concerning Ukraine and a peace solution for Ukraine. So he should be at the table everywhere where this table is organized. This is most important element, and this is because the result of the negotiations, this is also his responsibility as the democratically elected president of the country. So this is his responsibility, and he should be present involved in any kind of negotiations concerning his country. This is most important element.
Well,
nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine.
It's not his choice, is it?
So this is the questions of a rule-based order. If the order is really rules-based, he would be at the table, because this is one of the rules. Nothing about him without him.
Well, the rules are all in question, as Prime Minister Carney reminded us yesterday. Your Excellency, former President of Poland, Andrzej Duda, thank you very much for joining us here at Bloomberg House.
Thank you, Eric and President Duda. And thank you all for sticking with us and rolling along with some of the program changes that we've had today. I want to thank our sponsor, Marsh, for making this breakfast session possible. And to our audience watching online, and maybe some of you, we'll see you back here this afternoon for another amazing lineup. We have interviews with Ken Griffin, and also a session I'm looking forward to very much with Yuval Harari and Max Tegmark on the future of humanity. Nothing light, nothing too light here at Bloomberg House. So please join us then. Thank you very much.